Jim. There's one way to win. Only one way. Mothers and fathers organizing until we have a wall of resistance that will turn back this threat to this great country of ours and meet our duty as citizens to our children and grandchildren, and yes, those children that are not ours, as we are duty-bound as citizens of this great country. So continue to grow in your number and try to encourage your teachers, all of your teachers, black and white, whoever they are, none of them to accept a transfer under any circumstances because of trying to bring about a racial balance or to bring about forced racial integration. Ask them and urge them not under any circumstances to accept a transfer. The teachers alone, with your support, can win in this fight, because if they refuse to transfer, then the fight is won at that moment, and they can refuse to transfer if you insist upon it.
This man you see here is Lester Maddox, a former restaurateur and an owner of the once famous Pickwick restaurant. Maddox was an ardent segregationist, one who was an extremely loud voice pushing back against the civil rights movement and Atlanta's city too busy to hate moniker. You see, Atlanta was a city that had a unique political coalition, this in an era where segregation still reigned supreme throughout the Southeast. Longtime Mayor William Hartsfield had coined the moniker mentioned above, and he believed that the power brokers in the white community, like Coca-Cola CEO Robert Woodruff, and black community members like John Wesley Dobbs, could work together toward long-time political progress. Those motivations were primarily made to satiate both groups, convincing them that more money was made in the backroom meetings than would be achieved through an all-out public fight.
And he was right. For decades, Hartsfield's political coalition held firm power on the city of Atlanta, but that began to change by the 1950s.
As a younger generation of civil rights leaders, including those like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, felt that the older generation's slower methods of progress were inefficient and inadequate. So they took power into their own hands. They orchestrated boycotts and sit-ins at department stores and restaurants, writing letters of demand in newspapers, making it a point to make a statement. The in-your-face nature of these protests caused lower and middle-income white people to lash out, and Lester Maddox was one of the more prominent voices against the movement. Maddox would write little quips in the Atlanta Constitution Saturday newspapers. They were under the header of Pickwick Says, and in these little columns he would lambaste whatever politicians caught his ire. By the 1950s, his anger was pointed directly at those who favored desegregation. Maddox would eventually close Pickwick in 1965, and while he claimed that he had no hostility towards black people, he believed it was the right of private citizens to decide who they wanted to serve in their private business, or who they wanted to be associated with. This is what brought him into political prominence, and to eventually challenge Hartsfield in 1957. While Maddox lost by 18,000 votes, he won nearly 2/3 of the white middle-class vote, nearly half of the semi-affluent white vote, and 25% of the white upper-class vote. It should be stated that the latter two groups mentioned there were staunchly in Hartsfield's corner throughout his nearly 25-year tenure as mayor of Atlanta. The votes from these groups were in direct response to the civil rights movement that was unfolding in Atlanta, and that naturally raised some alarm bells.
So why is this man so important in the context of what we're going to talk about today? Well, Lester Maddox went on to become governor of Georgia in 1967, and he remained a staunch segregationist. And in that office, he did everything he could to fight off federal orders of integration.
It's this fight that Maddox fought, that Orville Faubus fought on those steps of Little Rock Central High School, that George Wallace fought in the streets of Birmingham, Alabama, and that the likes of John Rankin and Strom Thurmond fought in Congress. All of these men, former populist Southern Democrats who turned away from the party when they felt the party turned away from them, would be in lockstep with Donald Trump's plans to eliminate the Department of Education, sending the issue back to the states.
But what does it all mean? And why does there seem to be such a desire to undo almost all of the federal protections that have been given to minority groups in the United States? Where is it coming from? Is it just as simple as racism? Or is it something a little bit more nefarious than that? I think to answer those questions, we need to take a little deep dive on the history of education in the United States.
Wait, Americans must have the privileges of citizenship, regardless of race. And they are going to have those privileges of citizenship, regardless of race. But I would like to caution you and remind you that to exercise these privileges takes much more than just legal right. It requires a trained mind and a healthy body. It requires a decent home and the chance to find a job and the opportunity to escape from the clutches of poverty. Of course, people cannot contribute to the nation if they are never taught to read or write. If their bodies are stunted from hunger, if their sickness goes untended, if their life is spent in hopeless poverty, just drawing a welfare check. So we want to open the gates to opportunity. But we're also going to give all our people, black and white, the help that they need to walk through those gates.
Yeah. For the first 60 years of the country, schooling was very inconsistent from town to town and state to state. While people like Thomas Jefferson and several other founding fathers believed that a democratic republic needed enlightened and educated citizens, not all of them agreed on what the government's role should be when it came to providing it and where it should begin. Jefferson himself attempted to establish a public education system in Virginia. His model included 3 years of primary schooling, 3 years of intermediate schooling, 3 years of higher schooling, and eventually a few years of university. John Adams, another founding father, successfully implemented clauses on education in the Massachusetts state constitution. But there was a major problem when it came to the idea of providing public schooling in America. Early wars left the country broke as all hell. That meant little wiggle room for fancy things like education in the federal budget. Despite all that, over the decades, we'd start to see that idea shift a little bit. The biggest supporter of public schooling for the masses, and one of the people to actually get the ball rolling, was Horace Mann, a Whig Party congressman from Massachusetts who believed that education would be the great class equalizer and unifier. Mann helped create what would become known as the Common School, a subsidized, public alternative to private schooling. See, at this time, free schools, quote unquote, did exist, but they were primarily funded by philanthropic groups and came with social stigmas. Basically, sending your kid to a free school just kind of told the whole world that you were broke. One of the biggest parts of Horace Mann's movement is that he kind of broke the social stigma of the free school by making the common school a common practice, essentially demanding that the primary funding for these schools come from state and local governments. These earliest versions of K-12 schooling became so popular that the ideas even found their way into post-Reconstruction constitutions in the Deep South. By the 1930s, the end of what was known as the Progressive Era, 30 states required children to attend school at least through the age of 14, with 50% of Americans earning a high school diploma by 1940. American colleges existed since before the beginning of the country, but the first big federal investment came in 1862 with the passage of the Morrill Act. This act set aside land that once belonged to indigenous tribes for the cultivation of land-grant colleges and universities. The focus of these institutions would be for the benefit of agricultural and industrial arts. It's actually around this time that the first ever Department of Education was created, sponsored by Congressman and future President James Garfield, not the cat. It was signed into law by Andrew Johnson in 1867. Like pretty much everything Andrew Johnson touched, it crashed and burned, lasting 1 year before being moved into the Department of the Interior. This department was initially created to collect statistics and data regarding education around the nation, but it was also designed to assist former slaves with setting up their own schools. This led to prominent Democrats, and yes, they were Democrats at the time, like Fernando Wood of New York, to complain that the federal government was doing too much for those, quote, thousands of lazy, idle Negroes. People who do not work, people who will not work, people who are supported out of the public treasury by appropriations of Congress for illegal and improper purposes. Quick author's note. Please note that during this section, you'll hear me use the terms Negro, African Americans, black and black folks, freedmen, all those interchangeably. These are all referring to displaced Africans who were brought to the country for the purpose of slavery and their descendants. You'll also hear me change between collective first-person pronouns like we and us and our, as well as collective third person such as they, them, and theirs. Okay, back to the program. After abolition, black Americans were largely left on our own to develop education opportunities, though the federal government did step in one more time in 1890 when Congress passed the second Morrill Act. This version of the act declared that states must either integrate their land-grant institutions or set aside land for Negro colleges. This would lead to the creation of historically black institutions such as Alabama Agricultural and Mechanical University, Prairie View Agricultural and Mechanical University, Alcorn State, Delaware State, and many, many more. Now, it should be noted that part of the agreement with the Morrill Act was that the federal government would provide funding that they expected states to match on a one-to-one level. You can probably guess what happened to the HBCUs. States provided them with paltry support, meaning that they had to rely on federal and community funds only. A 1919 Federal Bureau of Education study on Alabama colleges found that from 1900 to 1916, Alabama A&M received a constant $4,000 annually, while Auburn University had received an average of $65,000 annually. Southern states were determined to ensure that if black folks had to be educated, that their institutions would be funded on an inferior level by any means necessary, only to then turn around and attack these institutions on the results of the neglect. That's for another time. One of the more popular education models for black people was developed by Civil War veteran Samuel Armstrong. Armstrong believed that African Americans were just as mentally strong as the white men, but immoral and needed industrial training to be taught their proper place in society. Armstrong built the Hampton Institute off this idea and convinced those like Booker T. Washington, one of his most prominent mentees, to do the same in Alabama, which created Tuskegee. This industrial training ideology became pretty pervasive and an underlying theme of African American education, with some men, like the aforementioned Booker T. Washington, subscribing to the idea that a well-trained black population would lead to steady income and the ability to create capital. Even when African Americans sustained their institutions by seeking out donors, white philanthropists would use their money and financial support to force technical training and teaching with the intent to abandon liberal arts altogether. Again, a lot of them did not believe that it was important to the Negro social role to learn liberal arts and anything beyond reading and writing and learning how to teach other people to work in the field. This is what happened with Fort Valley High and Industrial School, now known as Fort Valley State University. Fort Valley's initial president, John Wesley Davidson, would have to hide some of his curricular and learning activities when his donors would come to visit. Eventually, those donors sent their own spies to check out what was going on down there. Once they learned that Davidson had refused to stop teaching liberal arts to his students, they threatened to revoke their funding if he did not resign. This is just one example of how white philanthropists, or white men in position of power, would use leverage to dictate how black people could learn and what they could learn. Okay, so now let's fast forward to the 1940s. The next federal attempt I want to focus on is one of the signature programs of the New Deal, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a piece of legislation that aimed to help servicemen readjust to coming back home after World War II. Among the benefits were funds for college education, unemployment, and housing. This put higher education within the reach of veterans and is one of many items of Franklin Roosevelt's tenure that led to the baby boom in American economic prosperity. There was just one problem. Again.
Yes, what?
John Rankin, a 16-term congressman from Mississippi's 1st District, was the primary House sponsor of the bill. Rankin himself served in the U.S. Army during a brief stint at the end of World War I and used these accolades to earn goodwill in his state and throughout Congress. Rankin was one of the sponsors and architects of what would become the Tennessee Valley Authority. If you're not familiar, the Tennessee Valley Authority was a significant infrastructure development program that brought a lot of infrastructure to the rural South. But Rankin was also a staunch segregationist, believing that the constitutional rights of blacks were more secure under segregation and that poll taxes were a necessary defense to the communist plot to undermine elections. And these beliefs translated to Rankin's demands with any of the bills he worked on within the New Deal. Distribution should be decentralized, meaning that the federal government would not determine how to allocate funds locally. States will. Rankin's actions are the reason why you always hear about so many black veterans never getting the chance to utilize the GI Bill or waiting for years to hear anything back on their applications. He held up bills in committee or on the floor to ensure that decentralized distribution was a key proponent. So even at a time where the federal government's expansion was simply unprecedented, black people were intentionally left out in the cold. But that would all start to change in the 1960s.
Mrs. J.D. Marlin, and I think this is the most ridiculous thing that has ever happened. The Negroes are just as free as we are. They have the same opportunity to work and to build their part of the town up just the same as we have. I just don't understand it and don't approve of it. I'm going to stand up for my rights.
Thank you very much. Jim Knight with WALB Television News. We're soliciting the views of Albany people on the Civil Rights Bill. Would you like to give us your views?
Well, I think if they remain peaceful, it would be a lot better than perhaps the violence that would be concerned. Well, of course, being a Southerner, I'm not for it at all.
I see.
And I just don't know how it's going to turn out. I hope we don't have any trouble.
We're soliciting opinions on the Civil Rights Bill. Would you like to give us yours?
I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the time right now. I think they have equal rights, though.
Thank you very much. Would you like to express your views?
No, I don't think so.
How about you?
Nope.
What I'd have to say wouldn't be fit to go on air.
Thank you very much.
I don't like it. I think it's trying to put something on us that we don't want.
I see.
We ought to have a national election on it rather than just letting 9 men tell us what we got to do.
And how about you?
I feel the same.
Fine, thank you very much.
I sure don't like it, that's for sure.
I see. Do you feel this will have any effect on your life directly?
I imagine it will.
Thank you very much.
I'm afraid we might have niggers to live next door to us.
Thank you.
After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the presidency and was instrumental in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, 3 key bills in the pursuit of equality and equity for African Americans. Within that whirlwind of landmark bills, Johnson was pursuing the overarching goal of his presidency, his war on poverty. Johnson's goal was to use the federal government as a force to eradicate poverty and end what he saw as neglect of the rural South. I won't go into Johnson's history and childhood, but it should be noted that he came from pretty humble means, and that is what drove his policy vision. One of the many bills within his vision was the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, a massive bill that created federal expenditures for education throughout all 50 states with a focus on high standards and accountability. Within the bill were several divisions, known as titles, dedicated to certain sectors of the population. Title I, for example, would provide federal funds to schools who have significant amount of enrolled students living at or below the poverty level. Title II focused on libraries and textbooks while also funding preschool programs. Title III mandates educational programming, even outside of school operations, as well as special education and related services in rural areas. Title IV allocated money over a 5-year period for educational research. 5 supplemented state-level grants, and finally, 6 provided definitions and limitations within the law. Now, I'm pretty sure you can draw a conclusion to how important this bill was during a time where Black Americans were finally being recognized as citizens on an equal level and footing of their white counterparts, meaning that this aid was going to assist low-income Black populations as well as low-income white ones, with very few John Rankins to get in the way. The federal government's involvement in education is what would lead to Jimmy Carter eventually creating the Department of Education as a cabinet-level position during his presidency. The HEA basically is responsible for what would become the student loan system as well as the Pell Grants. Those will be built upon and really put into practice in the 1970s. It's also responsible for what would become talent search and trio. I really wish I would have put more time into that part. I apologize, but that's an important concept to know, and that act is just as crucial to everything else that we're going to talk about here. So how does this all tie into Donald Trump and his plans to cancel the Department of Education? Well, during his first term as president, Donald Trump hired Betsy DeVos, a conservative political activist and fundraiser, as his Secretary of Education. DeVos had no teaching experience and no education background, and primarily ascended into the role because of her activism as a school choice advocate. DeVos pushed for a nationalized version of school choice. If you're unaware, it's a theory that basically insists that public schools are failing and that state and federal funding can and should be used to give families vouchers to attend private schools instead. Up until 2020, states could withhold those funds from religious schools, but two Supreme Court cases, namely Espinoza v. Montana Department of Revenue and Carson v. Macon, ruled that if state funding was to be used on any kind of private school, it had to be available for use at all private schools, including religious ones. On the surface level, school choice advocate attacks on public schools work. Many Americans are indeed disillusioned with public education and its shortcomings. Never mind that federal public education funding as a whole has been contested since LBJ's presidency, and that individual states, particularly southern states, had stymied nearly every call from black leaders and communities for state aid up until that point. But that's neither here nor there. Generally, states provide a baseline amount of funding and require districts to make up the rest. This means that richer districts that pay more in property taxes have more funding for their schools versus poorer urban and rural schools who have less funding that can go into their school districts. This is what programs like Title I were meant to do: help close some of the gaps for school districts in low-income areas. Vouchers simply pull money out of the tax base and send it to private schools instead, further destabilizing public schooling. But beyond all of that, you really might be asking yourself, where the hell did the idea of school choice come from? For that, we've got to go back to the 1950s.
Ordinary parents, students, who kept on clearing the way for May the 17th, 1954, when something changed at last. Even as Chief Justice Warren began to read the decision, the wire service bells rang out in every single newsroom in the United States became deathly silent. First of all, it was black people themselves who were appearing before the courts in defense of their own rights. That was different. There had been change. Second, the court was unanimous. All 9 members spoke as one for the conscience of our country. That was different. There had been a change. Third, there were thousands who now felt free to work side by side in state by state, changing law after law. Many of you in this room helped to make those changes and to bring about those differences in the life of America. I don't have to tell you that change is not easy, and you certainly don't have to tell me that change is difficult.
So, quick little interjection here before I tell this story. The time period I'm going to reference is April 23rd, 1951. My father was born not 2 full months after these events took place, and my mother was about 3 years afterward. I say all of this and point this out to show that this stuff was not that far away. The people who lived these experiences are very much still alive. Okay, April 23rd, 1951. 16-year-old Barbara John organized a student-led protest over the substandard conditions of her school. Robert Russa Moton High School had no indoor plumbing, no gymnasium, lacked modern textbooks, had no cafeteria, no science labs, and relied on wood stoves for heat. Initially, they requested a new facility. The NAACP stepped in and encouraged the students to file a lawsuit to end Virginia's racial segregation in their schools. The RRMS case would be one of the cornerstones of what eventually became the landmark Supreme Court case, Oliver Brown et al. V. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, or Brown v. Board of Education, or Brown v. Board for short. This would eventually lead to a court order to desegregate American schools. This is the ruling that led to all those demonstrations I mentioned in the beginning, like the Little Rock Nine or all the demonstrations that happened in Atlanta over the 1960s. But where the story gets even more interesting is that one of the strongest opponents of the Supreme Court ruling was one Harry F. Byrd. Please say the Byrd. Byrd was an incredibly powerful senator who held an immense political grip on Virginia. Byrd owned several businesses, including several newspapers, a turnpike company, and more. His fear from the Brown decision was that if the federal government was strong enough to end racial segregation and discrimination, then in theory, that same government could tell him how to run his business on a more day-to-day operational level. Using his newspaper, Byrd launched attacks on the case, even being the lead writer on the Southern Manifesto, designed to garner support for resisting the Supreme Court ruling. Byrd used his influence and financial muscle to strong-arm the Virginia state legislature into passing a law that allowed them to revoke funds from and even close districts and schools that integrated black and white students. This led to school closures in Charlottesville and Norfolk. Prince Edward County, which is where the Moton School was located, closed down all public schools for nearly 10 years. Instead, white students would enroll at Prince Edward Academy, a private segregation academy, and the county school's budget was slashed and converted into tuition grants. These could be used by white parents to pay for their students' tuition at PEA. Now keep in mind, theoretically, anybody could have access to these grants. However, if Prince Edward Academy didn't let your child in because, say, they were black, then you couldn't use those tuition grants at Prince Edward Academy. Are we maybe starting to see where John Rankin's decentralization theory is coming into play here? And during this period of time, we see the same playbook pop up all over the South. A major rise in segregation academies. Really, you can go look and see how many private schools in your city or state sprung up between the early 1960s and the 1970s. Go look at who founded them and what their financial ties were. You might not be surprised. Anyway, these rulings from the judicial branch and orders from the executive branch of the United States government is what caused the southern states to begin lashing out at the institution's power. Yes, we're fully aware that it's not the first time it's happened, and really, Georgia Senator James Calhoun had been banging this drum about the government's power to abolish slavery way back in the 1830s. It also served as a major catalyst for Southern Democrats eventually leaving the party. Now, modern-day champions of the school voucher and choice movement are very vocal about their intentions not being rooted in race. But as demonstrated here today, it's kind of hard to ignore the idea's modern-day roots. Rather than advocating for solutions to fixing what is clearly a flawed public education system, their solution is to essentially do away with it and let the market, the parents, dictate which schools succeed and which ones fail. This would encourage failing schools to take whatever measures necessary to fix their flaws. While on paper that theory could make sense, the bigger issue is that plenty of nations have shown us that public schooling can be successful with proper investment and care. So why not put in the money, consultation, and intelligence necessary to better our schools? We all acknowledge that No Child Left Behind had the right idea but failed spectacularly because the policy proposals were, well, awful. That's for a different time and day, but the solution is not just to blow everything up and let everyone fend for themselves. So the question then becomes, why does President Trump wish to end the Department of Education, and in what ways will this benefit him? Well, there are two primary reasons. In the highlighted reasons above, there's a good portion of Trump's voter base and the voter base of the Republican Party who harbor some racial resentment for the civil rights movement and government expansion eras. They see the removal of the Department of Education as cutting away a life raft from groups they dislike. There may be some sense that their schools will naturally succeed, while non-white schools will surely fail because insert stereotype here. But Group A is racist is an oversimplification that does not give us a full explanation of how their anger and racism was corrupted by one reason or another. The more libertarian wing of the party sees education as something that can be privatized and invested in, which means fewer tax dollars collected and another way for them to make money. Again, be mindful that this does not cover everyone in Trump's circle or his supporters, but these are the primary two reasons why such a focus continues to persist in this day and age. Despite the number of school voucher programs that have created major blows in state budgets from the likes of Arizona and Utah, all of these vouchers cost more than simply investing further in public education and actually attempting to correct the flaws within the system. Charter and private schools could also possess levels of instability that public schools simply do not suffer from, especially because CEOs or owners of these facilities can simply choose to shut down on a whim, forcing families to flee elsewhere. Hell, I can probably do a deep dive into the mess that is the Memphis and Shelby County school system, which is rife with fly-by-night charter schools. Now, this is not to say that all charters are bad. There are plenty of successful ones that I can point to, and charter schools are not necessarily the result of school choice programs, but they can create major instability in a school system that doesn't have any rigid rules for how they're to operate. The other issue regarding these voucher programs is that the free market also allows these schools to simply raise tuition once vouchers become available, making the voucher program something that primarily becomes used by the types of families that could afford private education in the first place, and sending those who could not afford it back to even more severely underfunded public schools. It's a vicious cycle that just results in worse public schools and worse outcomes for students, regardless of where they're from. Eventually, only the richest of the rich are able to afford a quality education and pursue higher education for reasons that magnify beyond what we've talked about here.
So, what have we learned so far? Public education is a tricky subject in the United States. Much like any other public good here, the conversation gets a little bit muddied once you start talking about Black people getting involved in receiving said public good. It's just one of the many that have been contested over time and will continue to be contested as the country goes on, if it goes on. I'll be doing a lot more videos around here because I feel like history is important. The black and white photos and footage that we have from back in the 50s and 60s sometimes can make us feel like these times were so much further away than they actually were. My parents were both born and alive and well during the Civil Rights Movement. When Brown v. Board came down, my dad was 3 years old and my mom was a couple months away from being born. Ruby Bridges has an Instagram. Several members of the Little Rock Nine and the classes that came after them actually actively speak on different circuits. My father-in-law actually was responsible for integrating an Alabama high school back in the late 1960s. This stuff is recent, it's real, and it's important that we talk about it and be truthful in our conversations about it. And in our truthful conversations, we need to acknowledge that a lot of the people that oppose these things were teachers, principals, doctors, lawyers, lawmakers. Some of them went on to become governor, some of them senators, and even president of the United States. And it doesn't just die out one day. These people raise children. Those children raise children. Some of them imbued directly with these ideas. Some of them imbued more subconsciously. We've talked to people about unlearning things, right? That was the whole thing with the DEI initiatives, was not just to promote this idea that, hey, people who aren't white can be qualified, but also that, hey, maybe there's some biases that white people may have regarding people of color in different communities, particularly Black people, and we should work to unlearn those things. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. I've taken enough of your time. Thank you for letting me change shirts in the middle of this and not making a big deal out of it. If you like this content, please like, subscribe to the channel, share this video with family and friends. Help us sort of figure out a direction to go with this channel. Thank you to Ron and AJ and Dee and Courtney for letting me interrupt the Severance recaps. But I feel like when we started this blog long ago, and by we, I mean Ron, we had this idea of really talking about ideas and topics like race and the way that it manifests itself in media, as well as history and the laws around us. So I'm Mac. I appreciate you. I'll see you another time.
Here's how I would approach that issue as a statistician or a political scientist, or no, as a psychologist, which I'm not, is how abstract you handle the race thing. In other words, you start out, and now y'all aren't quoting me on this. You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now. You're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that is part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if it is getting that abstract and that coded, that we're doing away with the racial problem one way or the other. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, you know. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner.